Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site, bettingangle.us, a free site. It is November 15th, 2025. It's a Saturday morning. Let's talk boxing. Let's talk Joe Parker. Let's talk cocaine. But first, remember the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, we're hearing news that Joe Parker failed a test for cocaine after his fight against Fabio Wardley. Folks, this changes the heavyweight division. Let me give context. The time to make a bet, the time to rather know how you're going to bet, is before an event is even put together. Right, I believe savvy bettors are looking at styles in boxing and they're thinking about what happens if a fight is announced, the odds are a certain way, who's overvalued, who's undervalued, right? The public view is just a consensus view. It's not necessarily a thought out view. And where you make your money is in the gap between what the public thinks and what's actually going on. And folks, that's radically different in different genres, right? So take Palantir. They announced blowout earning numbers. Michael Burry at the same time was shorting Palantir. Alex Karp, was criticizing Michael Burry. The reality is that Palantir has to operate at near perfection to justify its price levels. It has a market, it has a long runway, but gee, it looks to me like that's already priced into the stock, right? The public, of course, even financial publications, many of them are pro Palantir, talking about the long runway, the markets it's serving. Other people are saying that's not the point. The point is the valuation, right? The forward PE that's well over 100. In boxing, people don't get that valuation point at all. I'm a huge fan of Alexander Usyk. I have been from before he was a heavyweight. I recognize that this is a great fighter. It was clear that he was world class, right? It was clear that whoever he was in the ring with, he was going to be competitive, right? Not necessarily win the fight, but be competitive. So, when he entered the heavyweight division, if you thought of him as a long shot, right, you were selling him short. In other words, Alexander Usyk, when he first became a heavyweight, he was undervalued, right? When he fought Chaz Witherspoon, he was undervalued. Then you got a second gift. He was uninspiring against Chaz Witherspoon. He was uninspiring against Derek Chisora. So here you had the talent, the guy who you privately thought could hold his own against the very best in the heavyweight division. And he seemed to be validating fears that an aggressive heavyweight like a Derek Chisora could back him up into a corner. Now, Joe Parker was one of those guys who I was prepared to take against Alexander Usyk. He's 5 or so years younger than Usyk. He's one of the best athletes in the heavyweight division. He is a guy who can move. He moves so well that some of Usyk's strengths, the fact that Usyk is a lefty, the fact that Usyk is an athlete, the fact that Usyk has a great jab that's underrated, has a mobile jab, would go out the window because Parker had the level of athleticism and had the variety in his game. In other words, Parker is not just front foot like Richard Torres, right? Torres is an athlete, but you know eventually he's going to come find you. No, Parker was the guy who could be a hunter, but he could also be the hunted. Right? You understood that Parker, too, was savvy. In other words, you watch this fight, and this was the guy who wouldn't throw certain punches until certain parts of the round. So the Martin Piccoli fight, he has it set up perfectly, where he throws the big overhand right in the closing seconds of the round, right? The closing portion of the round. So if that right hand missed, and if Piccoli, who is better than you think, had countered him and hurt him, Parker would have had the period between rounds to recover. In other words, this was the savvy guy, right? Athlete, diversified skills, savviness. Well, that's all out the window. Parker, cocaine, I don't know what the story is. But I'm just telling you, coke is such a big drug that now it's too risky to take Parker. It's even worse than that. You know, coke, the problem with coke is that coke comes with an ecosystem. And if Parker actually took coke, let's just say things are going to go south. In other words, you know, we've all had friends, particularly if you're a little bit older, if you're a child of the 80s, like I am, right? You've had friends who dabbled in cocaine. And whether or not they were able to handle it, there are people in the background who they were involved with to get the cocaine. Right? So the problem with Parker is that he's 33 or so. He's a father of many kids, right? I believe 6 kids. You know, this isn't the guy who is 21, 22, who's in the clubs, you know, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, right? Living in some place like New York City, Boston, London, right? This isn't that guy. This is the guy who's living a different life, who, you know, gets involved with a drug that might involve a dealer, right? Gets involved with a drug that, unlike marijuana, is very high margin, right? So understand the stakes are higher, right? There's more risk involved for the distribution network with cocaine. Let me say this too. There's a guy in boxing, he's a champ. I'm not going to give names because I believe in second and third chances, right? But he failed a cocaine test. And I believe he had to change his life. You know, the difference is you got the feeling this guy was the young guy hitting clubs, running the streets, right? You know, different social circles. Understand, when you start using coke, it's an all or nothing type affair, right? If you're in the hood and you know a bunch of people and you start using coke, and you decide, hey, I need to clean up, right? Folks, you literally have to leave where you're living. You can't stay in a coke infested place. where you know the players, right? Because the profit margin is too big for the drug. That leads to certain behavior, paranoia, etc., among the people involved with that culture. So this guy actually moved out of where he was raised, right? Got married, moved on with his life. Put differently, you understand that Rick James couldn't live in West Hollywood, right? As he got older, right? James, who, had a name, had money, made money, not only as an entertainer, but as, a creator of groups like the Mary Jane Girls, right? Rick James, real talent, musical savant. He had to get out of West Hollywood. He had to move to Burbank, and even that move wasn't enough. Because his personality was the kind of personality where he was never going to stop using cocaine. Right? So the problem I have with the Joe Parker story is he's already a guy who is out of the scene into the fatherhood part of his life, in a profession where he can't hit the club Thursday, Friday, Saturday, right? He, is in a profession where he has to prepare for fights. At his level of the game, the guys he's fighting are world class. They're going to be people like Martin Bacoli, like Fabio Wardley, right? These are legitimate contenders for the heavyweight throne. These are, in the sports world, among the most dangerous opponents anyone can have. Right? Also, if you're failing tests when you're involved in a fight, wow, when are you going to be able to stay away from cocaine? Now, I'm a big believer that you can't judge a book by its cover. Right? I've known guys who look as straight can look. And then you find out that they're involved with cocaine. Right? The minute you find out they're involved with cocaine, folks, that means they're involved with some sort of cocaine distribution network. That means that they have secrets, and the secrets involve people who are trying to protect huge profit margins. Right? So, let me also say this about Joe, too. You're 33. Let's say they ban him for 2 years. Right? When he comes back at 35, now granted, he's in the heavyweight division. Heavyweights age more slowly. But just understand that when he comes back, it's not like he's going to come back as the mandatory. He's going to come back and he's going to have to prove to skeptical fans that he's still world class. Right? Think of the heavyweight division today. Right? If Joe loses whatever appeal that he has, right? Lord knows there are countless guys. Fabio Wardley, the guy who just beat him. Right? Martin Bacoli, Efe Ajagba, Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Daniel Dubois, Philippe Ergovic. I can keep going. Richard Torres. There are many, Zhili Zhang, there are many guys in the heavyweight division right now who are credible opponents for the heavyweight champion. You're coming back from a cocaine suspension, folks. You're at the bottom of the list. Right? So if Joe Parker's suspended 2 years, it's going to take him another 2 years to look like a credible opponent with the public, to fight for the heavyweight title. So he's 33 now. He's going to be 37, 38 years old. There's some heavyweights out there we don't even know about right now who are going to be on the world stage in 2 years. That's the way it works. Where was Fabio Wardley 2 years ago? Right? That's how things work. Right? These guys work a lifetime, then suddenly they break through to the public. Suddenly you hear about Justice Hune. Right? There are going to be other names that actually have fire behind them with the public, that the public wants to see the heavyweight champ fight. Or that the heavyweight champ wants to fight because there's a payday involved, because the opponent has built up a constituency with the public. So Joe Parker at this stage, let's just say this is a major setback. Had a fight involving Joe Parker and Alexander Usyk been announced, I would expect Parker, coming off a loss, to be given by the market less than a 40% chance, less than a plus 50 in American odds of winning the fight. Understand, the minute that fight was announced, I would have been on the Parker side of the play. Right? Long term, you make more money betting on underdogs. Right? The same way Jake Paul, Gervonta Davis, and I'll agree, we'll never know who would win that fight. But when that fight was announced, I was surprised by the number of people on the Davis side of the ledger. I thought, wow, 135, and he's going up against a guy who weighed in the 220s against Mike Tyson, who beat Mike Tyson, who Tyson himself, days after the fight, said had punching power. I'm thinking, whoa, a dude who has punching power at heavyweight against a lightweight. Folks, I don't care if the lightweight's prime Roberto Duran. I'm taking the, guy who weighed in the 220s. You have to factor out all the noise. You have to think for yourself. You have to have price points. I would have taken Joe Parker. I was prepared to take Joe Parker against Alexander Usyk, the guy who really is the consensus champ right now, whoever is holding portions of the belt. Right? Usyk is the consensus champ right now. Had that fight been announced, and understand, Usyk has market power to the point where he can pick who he wants. Because even if he has to abdicate some belts, right, the public's going to view whoever he fights as a heavyweight championship fight. Right? Parker's completely changed things for me in the heavyweight division. You think of the elite athletes who actually have the skill set, right? And Parker really stood alone in terms of being credible opposition to these champions. Right? Parker, much tougher out, in my opinion, than Daniel Dubois, who just doesn't have the level of athleticism. Just look at Dubois' legs that a Joe Parker had. Right? I'm not saying Parker didn't have his problems, right? Joe Joyce beat him. Parker had a problem getting by Joe Joyce's jab, which was interesting, right? But let's just say this is a major blow for the heavyweight division. I'm not interested in the announcements of promoters that they aren't going to work with Joe Parker and stuff like that. Because in boxing, you have something called the uncrowned champion. Right? The guy, the boogeyman for the division. Right? It took so long for a heavyweight champion to decide to fight Sonny Liston that, believe it or not, the then reigning champion, Floyd Patterson, and his reign's one of the more interesting ones, right? Gets stopped by Ingemar Johansson and, looked undersized, had lost to Joey Maxim when he was younger on the way up, But then Floyd became champion, visited the White House, and believe it or not, in one of the famous moments in boxing history, the then President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, took the reigning champion, Floyd Patterson, aside and had a bit of advice. The advice was, don't fight Sonny Liston. Right? It took a reigning champ so long to fight Sonny Liston that Liston cleared out the heavyweight division. And then, of course, you had a group out there that viewed Liston as the heavyweight champion. So, understand, Liston doesn't have the belt that long. He beats Floyd. He has a rematch with Floyd. He beats Floyd in the rematch. Then he happens. I consider Liston to be one of the best heavyweight champs I've ever seen. Right? Then Liston happens to fight one of the few guys in heavyweight history who had the skill set to beat him, Muhammad Ali. Well, understand what Joe Parker was doing. Right? He beats Wilder. He beats Zhilei Zhang. He beats Martin Bakole. Folks, this is a Sonny Liston story. Right? Had he beaten Fabio Wardley, right, Usyk would have been at risk of losing his authenticity with the public. Whatever promoters thought. Whoever Usyk wanted to fight. That's who Joe Parker was. And in the Wardley fight, Parker gets buzzed in the second round. Okay. But then is winning the fight convincingly in some scoring methods. Right? One of the secrets to boxing is we don't all agree on the scoring. But just understand, one judge had Parker ahead. And it was a credible card. Right? This is boxing. Heavy puncher only has to be right once. Credit to Fabio Wardley for turning that fight around and winning the fight. But just understand how that's changed boxing. Right? Had Parker won the fight and not failed the Cope test, then he would have been right there. He could have shown up to Alexander Usyk fights. The press would have come and found him, whatever the ratings, at Usyk post-fight conferences, etc., some reporter someplace was going to say, hey man, when are you going to give Joe Parker an opportunity? Understand what happened with Shane Mosley. Shane Mosley lost to Vernon Forrest in the amateurs. So then Shane Mosley was the man in the pros, right? This is a guy who beat Oscar De La Hoya, if you believe the scoring. I don't, but he supposedly beat Oscar De La Hoya twice. Right? But Shane had a problem. He'd be at press conferences and someone would say, hey, Vernon Forrest is making noise as a pro. When are you going to fight Vernon Forrest? So you know what happened. Shane had to get the press off his back. There was this ghost chasing him, Vernon Forrest. Folks, Joe Parker was the ghost chasing Alexander Usyk. He loses to Fabio Wardley, so that ended, right? A big strategy in boxing is waiting until your ghost self-immolates, right? Then the kicker, the Coke test, right? Joe Parker fails a Coke test, so he's no longer at the front of the line. This is no longer the Sonny Liston, Vernon Forrest guy who is haunting even the most successful, right? The reigning heavyweight champ. One of the best ever at lightweight. That's who Shane Mosley was. Right? So this is a tragedy for boxing. So now Usyk really almost has a carte blanche. I love Fabio Wardley. He only has a puncher's chance. Right? Joe Parker, believe it or not, had a shot to beat Usyk on the scorecards. Right? Wardley, it's just a matter of, hey, can he land that big right hand? He doesn't even have enough of a left to bother a master like Alexander Usyk. So Usyk's going to have to slip up in that fight. Right? And we found out, 2 fights with AJ, that Usyk's a guy who has a reserve. So the key giveaway, when the mask drops off Usyk, is the 12th round of the first AJ fight. That's when you see the real guy. Right? He's beaten AJ through 11 rounds. Gets to the 12th round. There's about, I don't have the film in front of me, let's say a minute left in that 12th round. And in a fight, in my opinion, he knows he's already won. He wanted you to know that he won the fight. He wanted to dare the judges. If you're going to steal this from me, you're going to have to explain yourself. So he puts on a show the last minute of the 12th round of his first fight against Anthony Joshua. Right, folks? Joshua's lucky to survive that round. Right? Joshua's the guy who was born on third base with the fans, who might not have appreciated how close the rest of the heavyweight division was to him. Right? So Joshua is pummeled. He's pummeled in the closing minute of that first Usyk fight, and you realize this Usyk guy has been measured the whole fight. There's a reservoir that this guy still had. Right? Usyk's a guy who, if this were the old days, and he had to go 3 more rounds, he'd be able to do it. Right? You know, when Ray Robinson is overcome by heat exhaustion against Joey Maxim, just understand that was in a 15 that was a fight scheduled for 15. I believe Robinson checks out like the 13th round. Right? Today, Robinson would beat Joey Maxim if they fought the same fight. Usyk was showing you that he had at least 3 more rounds left in him. Right? So Usyk, Fabio Wardley, Usyk is going to be ready those last few rounds. Right? Wardley is, not Joe Parker. Right? The threat is not the same. Just food for thought. So, the heavyweight division is going to be different now. Right? Joe Parker is out of the mix. Usyk is 38. He has plausible deniability as to not fighting Joe Parker. In other words, this isn't a situation where, later in life, there are going to be questions. Right? The question to Ray Robinson was, hey, why didn't you fight Charlie Burley? There's some who would question Ray Leonard and say, hey, why didn't you fight Aaron Pryor? Right? There's some who would question Floyd Mayweather, and I'm just naming some of the best fighters I've ever seen in my life. Why didn't you fight Antonio Margarito? Now, Robinson and Leonard had to be evasive in terms of Burley and Aaron Pryor, who was a great fighter who himself was brought down by cocaine and eye problems. Just understand, Mayweather was able to say, look, Margarito got busted with plaster of Paris on his gloves. Right? How much of the Margarito story do we know is true? It might be most of it, it might be little of it. Right? Just understand, Usyk will be able to say Joe Parker failed a coke test. right? That'll end the discussion on that topic, and it's sad because Parker, of course, has been a heavyweight champion, right? Parker, during Usyk's career, was really the uncrowned champion for a portion of it. I would have taken Parker in a second. You know, if they announce the fight, you want to sit back for that first second to see where the line hits, right? So you're thinking, you know what, Parker above a plus 150, I'm in, right? If they drop the line, you want to see the first way it moves, right? So let's say they drop that line and it's a plus 150. And I say, great, that's a price point I'm interested in, right? You don't want to bet it right away. If you do, you don't want to bet your full amount. You want to wait a few days. The way public mood operates is that there are a bunch of people out there who, once the consensus forms, they're in. So that 150 could have moved to a plus 160. Could have moved to a plus 170. Right? You want to wait until the line starts moving against you. That's when you strike. Folks, I was prepared to do just that with Joe Parker. He's credible opposition. Just like people here know, I privately rate, and I'm open about stuff like this, I privately rate Filip Hrgovic much higher than the public does. I mean much higher. Right? So they announce an Hrgovic fight. Chances are I'm on the Hrgovic side of the play. Right? He's only lost once, and that was to a fight he's dominating early, right? He's landing so many right hands, it's ridiculous. What he should have done, and you always need to do an autopsy on a fight, what he should have done is in the fourth round, he should have taken it off. In other words, he starts, his big enemy there was the fact that Daniel Dubois had no defense. So Hrgovic is fighting himself. That's the fight I saw, right? He throws so many right hands that land that he literally punches himself out, right? Dubois, granted, offensively looked good, but Dubois doesn't take over that fight until later. Hindsight's 100%. But if you're a fighter and you're in a fight and it's too easy the first 3 rounds, you've got to say, you know what? Should that happen, I need to take round 4 off. I need to just come in. Hrgovic had better legs than Dubois. I need to just move away from Dubois. Crowd could boo. Who cares? I've already, shown I can win back-to-back rounds against this guy, right? Take the 4th round off, then come back in the 5th round, right? Understand, and I mentioned this in an earlier video, I believe Dmitry Bivol takes 3 rounds at a time off against Beterbiev. Both fights. Right? Hrgovic threw himself out. If you have your own favorites, Joe Parker was one of mine. I have to use the past tense now because Alexander Usyk, who said he wants to fight until he's 41, doesn't have to fight him. Parker's going to be out of the sport for 2 years if he's convicted. And folks, these positive coke tests don't happen by accident. This isn't marijuana where you can say, hey, I was at a concert. Hey, I was at a club and the guy next to me was smoking, and this is secondary. Look at how low the, positive test reading is. Right? With cocaine, folks, what's the explanation? Right? He's going to have to go Ben Johnson and claim that someone spiked the drink he was having. Right? What are the odds of that when you're talking about millions of dollars at stake and a guy who is 1 fight away from fighting the heavyweight champion of the world? So just understand, Joe Parker's going to be out of the sport for 2 years. Then he's going to be trying to re-earn the trust of the public for another year. By then, Usyk, who has to privately know this dude would have been one of my toughest opponents, is going to be hitting the exits. Right? The fight won't have enough build-up to force Usyk to fight him in a farewell fight. Right? I think personally, Usyk would have rather fought Tyson Fury, who he's beaten twice and who he knows, while he might not be a better boxer than Tyson Fury, he's certainly a better athlete than Tyson Fury. Right? So Usyk could have sensed to himself, you know what? I can move away from this dude. You know, if it gets hot in the kitchen, I can leave the kitchen and go into the living room. Right? With Joe Parker, he didn't know that. Right? It's hot in the kitchen. I go in the living room, and this son of a gun has followed me here. What's my next move? He would have been forced into that part of the decision making. Here, incredibly, it's Joe Parker himself who has let him off the hook. The heavyweight division now has shifted. Let me also say, too, that I don't think anytime soon Alexander Usyk is going to say, hey, Filip Hrgovic, let's have at it. Right? He understands the public's not keeping track. They don't know that Hrgovic has beaten Adelaide, Zhili Zhang, Joe Joyce, the boogeyman for Joe Parker, right? And so the public doesn't seem to realize that that Dubois fight's the only fight Hrgovic has lost, right? The public's demanding others. I think, you know, Usyk can say, hey, I'll fight the others, privately knowing they're easier for him than people the public's overlooking. That's how I see it. Let me hear from you. I hope you leave your comments in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.